So this live streams, right? We should probably update the intro script.
Yeah, but it usually depends whether one of us that has access is online. So.
I gotcha.
Yeah, but yeah, we can say record our live stream. Yeah. Also, big thanks to Ash, who, if you've noticed, has archived most of this document, so that it's a lot easier to work with.
Oh, that's great. Just give it another minute. All right, we can probably get started. Not seeing anyone new join. So everyone, just a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and it'll be posted. It's actually being live streamed to YouTube. So your participation in the meetings is an agreement to abide by the Cloud Native Security Code of Conduct, which can be found in the repo. Can I get somebody to volunteer as scribe for today? Thank you, Brant. All right, the goal there is just to get some written notes that can be referred to after, since this is going to be streamed. All right, we do have a presentation today, but before we jump into that, is there any new members on the call that want to give an introduction?
Sure, this is Ryan Gibbons from 3M. I've met a few of the people here, big fan of the work. We use it quite a bit in our code security program at 3M for our secure software supply chain. So I've been attending the last few of these tag security meetings and just really excited to hear about your next projects.
Good to see you here, Ryan. By the way, any chance
Brandon.
I can get that spreadsheet from you? I know we talked about
Yeah. No, I actually made a post on that in one of the channels. I've already got it cleared for legal. I'm just waiting for final approval, and I'm going to post that. So happy to.
Awesome. Yeah. So I guess a little bit of context. Ryan gave talk at SecurityCon in Valencia, talking about how they use the supply chain best practices white paper and kind of like implemented it within the organization. So it's very exciting stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, anybody else? New member? All right. I don't think we have anything that I'm aware of for 2 through 4 here. So do we want to jump to project updates? Audio, supply chain, serverless, security pals.
Sure. I have a one from supply chain. So supply chain working group has been working on a questionnaire for to kind of get thoughts right now, at least from CNCF projects, on what their perspective is right now around supply chain security. Do they feel prepared for it? Would they be? Are they aware of what we're doing in this group, and would they also be willing to sort of participate in like a pilot sort of program that maybe we come in and evaluate, assess how they're doing against the supply chain security best practices, secure software factory, that sort of thing. So the initial draft of that is done, and I will actually post it here in Slack. Sorry, I'll post it here in Zoom chat in 1 second. Let me just make sure I have the right one. Where is this? Yep. So these are the questions for right now. And it's reasonable for our first draft. And so we want to actually send this out to like a handful of CNCF projects to start off with, figure 3 to 5 or something like that, just to kind of get a basic idea of like, are the questions off base? Do things, get feedback from other groups? Like, is it, do we need more? Do we need less? That sort of thing. So actually, one of the things that I'm not sure how to do, and this kind of for folks like Brendan Lum is like, what do we need to do to just get this sort of thing sent out to just a small set of CNCF projects, and so that we could get the feedback, and then after we get the feedback, we plan to just do, I guess, like one more draft, and then push it out to just the CNCF at large. And then this would then be followed somewhere down the line of also potentially modifying some of the questions to focus more broadly on the end user community as well. But yeah.
Yeah, I think we can reach out to some of the folk that we've done like security assessments with. I think they should be keen to kind of like participate in this.
So cool. So should we just reach out to some of these groups directly and just get the feedback, or is there a better?
I think initially that should be good. Like I know, like Set Manager, obviously one of them that we've been talking to. Maybe like Set Manager, Kubernetes. We can probably reach out to some other projects that we've done security assessments. So like Spire, OPA, Harbor, folks that we've worked with, right? So at least we have the relationship. Yeah, we can chat more offline about this.
Sure. So sounds good. Yeah, and then beyond that, we're still working on a couple of the other pieces like the SBOM and whatnot.
Awesome. I have a quick update for the controls work. So we're getting a lot of interest in the project, maybe between 1 to 4 people a week for the past few weeks have been reaching out, jumping into the issue. We have broken down our work into 3 main categories. We have some current maintenance going on of what we delivered in phase 1. We have modernization of that format, moving things into OSCAL, kicking off. And then we have an expansion and an automation kind of on the assessment side, working as well, trying to integrate with other projects. So that's moving along really nicely. We just kicked off some repositories in a new organization just to bundle that code together. And I wasn't sure exactly if there was precedence for that. I'm just keeping it out of the tag security repo for now, and then we can figure out where it lands at the end, if we want to merge it back in or make a new repo under CNCF for that or what. So things are going really nicely there, moving along.
Also, would you and the others be able to do maybe a session for one of the upcoming Wednesday meetings to share this with the broader group? At least like high level what you want to achieve and some ideas and some thoughts around it, just to get some feedback.
Yeah, one of the takeaways from the last meeting was over the next week and a half, we want to clarify our goals as a group. We have a little bit overly broad ideas, and so we want to focus them a little bit and decide if how we want to share that. But in this meeting would make sense as well to share that. So we'll figure out. I don't know if Pratik's on. He is leading up that work. If not, yeah, we can get back to you on timing and such. Right, any other project updates?
I do, from the Cloud Native Security White Paper audio recording. Hope I'm audible.
Yeah,
Sorry,
we can hear you.
So little background, the team has put in humongous efforts to record, review, and edit to take to the release for the Cloud Native Security White Paper audio recording version 1. And we are currently posted the same in SoundCloud, but the official release via the blog post and Twitter releases is ongoing. So I'm chalking out the final steps, and we have sent the blog draft to the marketing team and awaiting their inputs on the next steps. And meanwhile, I have created an issue 953, for reviewing and re-recording the audios to include and stay in line with the version 2 of white paper. So I've pasted the link in the chat. You can check it out, and please feel free to express your interest to contribute this project. And once we have enough interest, I plan to schedule a kickoff meeting so we can plan for the next stages of the V2 recording.
Awesome. Anyone else? All right. So I think we're all set. Barak, if you want to take over sharing screens. So we're going to be talking through the presentation in 897 on IBOM.
All right. I'll need you to give me control over sharing. Thank you very much. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for joining. I have here with me Taylor Smith, who's the product manager of our open source projects. My name is Barak Shuster. I'm the chief architect of those projects, coming in from Palo Alto, Prisma Cloud / Bridgecrew, and from the maintenance team of an open source project named Checkup. So it sounds like everybody on the call already know what SMO is. My goal is to talk about something that we have identified during audits, going through compliance benchmarks of FedRAMP and others, and working with other people going through similar audit processes. We feel like part of the SBOM, part of the software supply chain inventory list, there is a missing piece, which is not only the packages themselves that people are using, like package log files, etc., and everything that is mentioned there, or POM files and everything that is mentioned there. We feel like a missing piece in the bill of material is the cloud inventory. And there are a few reasons that led us into that specific thinking. So there are various ways to say that, but our cloud web application is built from APIs, which we scan for security best practices using WAS or other API security tools. We have our own source code scanned with SAS, DAST, IAST, open source where we use software composition analysis tools, containers where we use solutions like CWPP, whether it is open source or commercial use cases. There is also infrastructure as code, the manifest, the configurations that getting provisioned into a portion of our cloud infrastructure. And when we look on Cyclone DX or SpeedX, those are not really mentioned there. And why do I want them to be mentioned there? Because in Log4j, for example, we had different cloud providers with a specific set of services being vulnerable to that specific vulnerability, to that specific CVE. And there are other cloud vulnerabilities out there. And there's also misconfigurations in the cloud providers that are covered by areas like CSPM and like the Cloud Custodian project that is part of the CNCF. And when I want to understand from what my own application is built from, it's actually not built only from Kubernetes and the containers and the Java or Node code. It's also counting on ECS Fargate. It's also counting on EMR in some cases, on EC2 instances, etc. And I want to have a list of inventory showing to me the services, their versions, and are they patched already or not. In the following slides, I'm going to review some specific issues that I would be happy to see as part of the SBOM that I call now IBOM, an SBOM that is focused on the infrastructure layer with specific use cases and specific risks. One use case is, am I using vulnerable cloud infrastructure? Like, does one of the vendors have identified vulnerability in the cloud provider? Do I have misconfigured infrastructure as code that will be manifested into misconfigured runtime? Am I using an old version of Elasticsearch, for example? So in AWS, I might have an old instance of Elasticsearch 6.1, which has a CVE announced, and I'd like to update it to 7 point something or to OpenSearch. Am I using an old version of Terraform module? I'm saying Terraform every time, but really what I mean is any infrastructure as code. Terraform is just the most common one, but the same can apply on CloudFormation, on serverless framework, etc., etc. Am I using non-immutable modules? So this is kind of around the areas of signing that mentioned in Salsa. Terraform modules are not immutable unless you're using commit hashes referencers. And am I using an offensive module of Terraform? So let's see each one of those examples. So over here in my infrastructure as code, in my Terraform, I have an old version of Elasticsearch, and I want the IBOM to answer me, am I using an old version of Elasticsearch, like 6.1, and did the cloud provider patch that already? Another example is an offensive Terraform. Over here, I have a Terraform block where I have a data block and an output block. The data block is actually provisioning a Python script that is a malware. I might import a code from the internet, a module from the internet that has this specific snippet that can run arbitrary code within my CI/CD pipeline and either use the CD pipeline as a crypto miner host or exfiltrate some of the secrets. Another example is a Terraform block where I can have a data block that is sending, whenever I'm running Terraform plan, secrets to a bad domain, like a random database secret that is generated. And I can have the classic, which is misconfigured infrastructure as code within my code. For example, I'm using S3 bucket. Everything is fine with the S3 bucket. It's not like S3 buckets have versions that needs to be patched, but it's just misconfigured. And we can look at misconfigurations similar to CVEs. Those are known bad things that I can do when I'm writing infrastructure as code. And I can also use public modules from the registries. So Cloud Posse is an amazing consultancy for DevOps engineers. They are great people. And they patch their code, for example, for the S3 bucket to version 0.47.4. But if I'm still using in my code an old version that is outdated, I might not get all of the good defaults that exists in the newer version. So having in an infrastructure as code bill of material, the version that each infrastructure as code module is using, and am I using the paved road of how resources should be provisioned in the cloud, is an answer that I'd like to have. And the last is I want to use Terraform modules from the internet because or from private registries. It helps me to organize configuration, to encapsulate it, to reuse it, to have consistency, and have, just like for the same reasons I'm having packages for Python or Node, I want to have a paved road within my enterprise for cloud infrastructure provisioning. But if I'm creating those modules or using open source modules, and those are not vetted for, am I using the latest version? Am I using immutable modules? Am I using modules that are not misconfigured by default? Or am I using modules that runs arbitrary codes that leaks secrets or etc.? I'm putting my CD pipeline at risk. And in my opinion, risking the infrastructure layer of the system has very high risk, more than an application code that runs in one microservice. In the infrastructure layer, Terraform needs admin access to the cloud provider in order to provision resources. So some of the attack surface is even larger. And the right way, this is like the equivalent, it's not exactly signing, but it's an equivalent of having a container image SHA, would be instead of validating that when I'm referencing Terraform modules in the code, I'm not referencing them in this way with a version tag, because version tags are using Git tags, and Git tags are not immutable. You can delete and override them. And not like this example, which is using the latest version always. I want to have strictly defined ID that is immutable when I'm referencing modules, which is that's the syntax to do that. So it's not exactly signing, but it's referencing the specific SHA or digest of a specific Terraform module. And Terraform modules, like open source packages, have the notion of having transitive dependencies. I can reference a module that can reference two other modules that can reference a set of other modules, and I can have a chain of dependencies between modules that are injected into my code. And by just running grep command over my Terraform code within GitHub, I won't see what are all the modules that are being used, because there are transitive dependencies when I'm importing module that is importing another, that is importing another. And there is no way for me to get that visibility from a GitHub search. And there is also no log file currently for most of the infrastructure as code frameworks. So Terraform, for example, is an amazing open source tool that I'm a huge fan of, and the most popular infrastructure as code framework. It has a log file, but it is only existing for provider dependencies, which are packages written in Golang. And for Terraform modules, which are the way to create paved road for cloud resources provisioning, there is no locking mechanism outside of having those immutable Git references. So there is actually a gap there that is not handled by the Terraform lock. What am I suggesting? So I'm one of the maintainers of the project named Chekhov, which is an open source under Apache 2 license, has a bunch of checks that its core initiative was to identify misconfiguration in infrastructure as code. But since then, it now monitors 17 configuration frameworks, from Terraform to Kubernetes to Helm to customize Bicep, etc. We recently added or had a collaboration with, I think, a contributor from Sonatype that in last October have contributed originally to Chekhov the Cyclone DEX format. And we've also created some of these Salsa compliance checks within Chekhov, and we are internally using Chekhov to produce both Salsa. Some of its work is already open source. Some of it is underway and it's going to be open source soon. And we're using Chekhov to create IBOMs internally. So, for example, when I'm internally, I'm responsible for our FedRAMP compliance program. in FedRAMP, I'm requested to get a list of inventory of cloud resources and all of those dependencies and their versions, etc., and their misconfigurations and where are they provisions and from where, etc. I'm using Chekhov. How am I doing that? So I'm running Chekhov over, so pip install Chekhov, that's the way to install the tool. Running Chekhov minus directory on the local directory where my Git repository is, and choosing an output format, which is Cyclone or CSV. Currently, the auditors that I've worked with are still asking for CSV. We are working on adding SPIDX format into Chekhov too. And on CLI, it will give me an output like, this is the Docker containers that you're using, those are the Terraform modules that you're using, those are the misconfigs they have. On Cyclone, the format will be different, and I'll have all of the resources of infrastructure as code listed here. And I want to skip it for a second and show you how it looks like in CSV just for the having the conversation about it. And we can drill down to the Cyclone in a minute. It's spitting out a bunch of CSVs. One of them is the classic one, seeing licenses and vulnerabilities over Git repositories on different paths for each of the open source packages. But the one that we've extended it to is seeing the cloud resources that are written in infrastructure as code. So seeing the S3 bucket resource, what's the path of it, what's the Git organization, what's the Git repository, what's the configuration that it's having, and the severity is the piece that we call IBOM. So if I'm to annotate that, that's the IBOM, and that's the classic piece. And another piece of the IBOM is what's actually running in my AWS account. So we're using AWS, but you can generalize that to any popular cloud provider. In AWS, a resource has an ID, an ARN. What are the ARNs that I have out there in the cloud provider with their type and the account and the misconfigurations? And that list can really serve me for asking the questions that I've asked before, like, do I have an Elasticsearch in my organization? When Elasticsearch is announcing a specific, an AWS Elasticsearch is announcing a specific vulnerability, or do I have any misconfigured resource in the runtime account, in the provisioned cloud resources? Or am I using a resource or a module that has a misconfiguration, like running offensive code, doing secret leakage, etc., on my infrastructure code? So the goal is the same as preventing the next Log4Shell, but on infrastructure code level instead of application code level. And there is also a solution for signing, which is, for now, as long as Terraform does not have a signing mechanism, using immutable references in modules. Going back to one of the gaps that exists in the current bill of material formats, and the same apply for any format that I've seen. The current formats try to categorize the application by application, container, device, library, file, framework, operating system, or service. And on those formats, the service would be a service like an API that is out there. Now, if all of the services out there were using stuff like Google Maps API and that's it, I would say, all right, service is a good enough solution. But the fact is that part of the bill of materials, services does not have, at least in the Cyclone format, does not have known vulnerabilities that can be attached to, like components of applications. We cannot map configurations to them, and we can, like, it's not good enough as an exchanging format to say, hey, I'm the organization Palo Alto Networks, and I'm using the following cloud infrastructure resources, and I want to exchange this data with another enterprise that wants to know if I'm using a vulnerable cloud infrastructure. I cannot on the current format. So I'm saying, is it the right time to, or asking or recommending, is the right time to add another thing here called cloud resource. Excuse me for my writing using Zoom annotation. And this cloud resource, we can actually split it to two. It can be code mentioned cloud resource, which would point to the Terraform or Kubernetes manifest or whatever infrastructure as code you're using, CloudFormation if you're a fan, or CDK. And to the runtime instance of it, because not always I'm provisioning all of my code, and not always all of my cloud resources are provisioned directly from code. There is still a lot of ClickOps out there in some of the enterprises. So having a full list of all of the services, both in runtime and in code, would be giving me the right inventory. One more slide, and then I'm done blubbering, and really I'm open to discussion if you want to stop me in the middle too. So my takeaways when I'm doing internal audits and with talking with other that are in the cloud security space is that OSS dependencies and container images alongside them are one of the parts in the cloud application ecosystem. Infrastructure is another one. And my belief is that SBOM should be extended with the term cloud infrastructure or IAC, including the runtime instances, like knowing on which server the software is running is efficient data. You can use Chekhov to generate a bit of material of IAC resources. So if you'd like, I highly recommend it. That's how I do it. And they recommended guidelines if I were to guide the community on how to write an IBOM and what to do with the materials that sourced with it is to vet module sources, to verify immutability, to check for misconfigurations and arbitrary code that can be executed as part of my supply chain and exfiltrates secrets. And as far as I know, Chekhov is currently the only open source tool that can produce that. So thanks to a collaboration between two different cloud security vendors. And an IBOM completes the definition of provenance into the cloud native technology, which is the cloud provider stack. So this is mainly the broad idea of IBOM that I wanted to present. Any feedback, questions?
I think a question I would have, especially considering like the cloud native landscape of, different infrastructure that is supporting application and in their runtime, is just how might this fit into, existing infrastructure, i.e. Kubernetes, right? Like it's there, it's not explicitly defined as this is explicitly attached to my application. My application doesn't really have knowledge of the infrastructure, but I'm assuming there's a way to tie the two together.
Yeah, so I can show you how it looks like. So maybe I have a demo over here. So this is Chekhov. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's really easy to use. And the way to run it is by running the pip install command and then scanning a directory. The directory can have any type of infrastructure as code, and it's supporting a lot of infrastructure as code frameworks. And when I'm saying infrastructure as code, I count Kubernetes, Kustomize, and Helm as another IAC. And if you have within the code repository any manifest of those types, it will let you know that, hey, your pod or service or container is misconfigured, and it will add them to the bill of material. And it will add them to the misconfigured list of resources. So I'll show you an example on how the output looks like in human readable format for Kubernetes. And a similar thing would be for CSV or Cyclone. So let's say that I have the following misconfigured Kubernetes manifest. This is the one. I've already written in comment what's the problem with it, but there are a bunch of other comments. And when you run checkup -d with the filter of running only on Kubernetes and not on all of the frameworks, assuming that you have a manifest within that directory, that's the output that you will get. You haven't minimized the admission of the containers. You haven't configured seccomp, or depends on the version of checkup and of Kubernetes that you're using. You don't have liveness prob, memory limits are not set, etc. So it will list a number of issues that you have, and it will say, hey, the resource here is a pod, the resource here is a container, the resource here is whatever that needs your attention and is part of your application. Now, infrastructure as code provision usually more than one service or microservice, but think of it as like there isn't. Internally, we had a debate of is IBOM part of an SBOM of each application or another layer, but in my opinion, it should be part of the SBOM because your application cannot live without it. It's a dependency and it can be misconfigured. Does it answer your question?
Yes, that's perfect. Basically coming down to context of the application being deployed. So Kubernetes, you have an application, you have your orchestration, you can tie those intimately together pretty well. And then that might be a pretty concise IBOM as opposed to, the infrastructure that it's deployed on top of might be a separate IBOM that you're packaging up to say like, hey, here's my my cloud infrastructure. And it's kind of separating the two.
Yep, and I know that Taylor is here too. So Taylor, if I'm missing anything, feel free to chime in.
No, I think you've covered it well.
Awesome, thank you.
So I had a question about how you might envision scenarios where infrastructure as code is provisioning services that aren't really versioned, right? So I'm like thinking in particular about this EKS vulnerability with IAM that happened recently, and it was in the control plane and just kind of got patched. And sure, there are some components that you might, like if you're using EKS anywhere, you might care about, but on the EKS side, you didn't. I'm kind of thinking of that as an example, but many different scenarios like that where there isn't actually a version, some of that information might not be shared currently. Would you, like, generally, do you have thoughts on that? And also, would you envision scenarios where the cloud providers now provide IBOMs and then there's some sort of a linking to create versions where there isn't currently a versioning?
So my thinking is that not the cloud provider should create the IBOM, but the owner of the AWS account. So let's say that we have a company called Acme and another one that is Acme customer. The Acme customer would like to know, does Acme use EKS now? That's the question that I want to answer. And if Acme is publishing, hey, one of the services that I'm using is EKS, and EKS is suddenly in the news of having a vulnerability, that will give the understanding to the Acme customer if their vendor is putting them at risk because it's using an currently unpatched cloud provider. That's one example. For CVs on EKS, like you've mentioned. So it's answering, am I using that service? That's the question. And it's not always telling me the version. You're correct. It can tell me, am I using a service with an old module that is misconfigured by default in its own version? But on runtime, it won't always tell me the answer.
Now you can, Barak, do you think that timestamp would help? You could correlate timestamp plus EKS means you're probably vulnerable.
Yeah, that's correct. That's why. So thank you for making the point there. That's why I'm saying the Acme customer would like to know, is my vendor vulnerable now? And now being the timestamp of the vulnerability, or was it vulnerable when I had sensitive data hosted in that vendor, etc. So yes, timestamp would be the way to correlate that knowledge.
Yeah, I have one question. So in the example that you showed, right? So the checkout, you can run it on the directory, basically on the static artifact, right? But you show the in the SBOM for services, it showed the CRN and everything. So CRN gets assigned after the provisioning, right? So how do you get the CRN info during static analysis?
Sorry, what info? I can go
Oh,
back
the
to
CRN, the cloud resource number.
Oh, the ARN. So
yeah,
in Chekhov, there are two modes. The open source version will only give you the infrastructure as code. There is another version which is with API token under different license that can use CSPM capabilities to give runtime data. But when I'm talking on open source only, that would be only the infrastructure as code bill of material. The complete, in my opinion, the complete output, like Cyclone DX output or CSV output, should include the runtime data. And I'm saying, if you're using Chekhov with API token, like the commercial offering, yes, you'll get it from the commercial offering. But if you're using a CNCF solution like Cloud Custodian, maybe you can export that inventory also into the SBOM of the live cloud infrastructure. And it's the same suggestion, whether you're using a vendor solution to get the data. I'll go back to it. So you were talking about the ARN, the resource IDs.
Exactly.
So whether you're using a CNCF solution like Custodian or you're using a commercial offering like Bridgegroup Palo Alto, these data, in my opinion, still should be part of the infrastructure bill of material, regardless of where you're using it, where you're getting it from. It can also be directly from the cloud provider if you're using the Tag Explorer in AWS, for example.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
I had another question. So you had mentioned SPDX as a future project. Is that currently under development? And it seemed like your analysis thus far was a little bit focused on Cyclone. Correct me if I'm wrong. Are you seeing different or similar issues? One of the like initiatives or conversations I think CNCF has been having is whether or not the CNCF should, or the tag security should, look into what minimum information should be in an SBOM, and just kind of wondering if you're seeing different sorts of gaps across the different specs right now, focused on your IBOM concept and components.
Yeah, great question. So SPDX is currently under development. I hope that in a couple of months we'll have it. If Taylor will hold me to it. So he's the PM of it. And there are some data points that are not relevant. Like the cloud provider does not have a license. But if I want to go through a cloud audit, for example, even SOC 2 audit, I need to give the auditor a list of services that I'm using and whether all of those services are SOC 2 compliance or FedRAMP compliance, etc. So I would use the license field to say, I don't have a licensing issue, but I might have a compliance issue with one of my cloud services. That's a gap that I have both in SPDX and Cyclone. And it gives me the same legal issue in the organization. I'm supplying a software that is not compliant, whether it is because of a bad license or because the third-party service is not compliant. So the same issue there. And also, SPDX does not have the separation between an application to cloud infrastructure as code that is provisioned by someone else. It is very focused on signatures and licenses, but I think it should be expanded. And there is terminology there like packages. So package can be infrastructure as code module. It's practically the same. But if I have my own source code, my own resources defined in Terraform, there is no easy way to identify that because is a resource name a package name? It doesn't really make sense. So it's abusing it for that specific cause.
Okay, one last question, and then I'll pass it to you, Brandon. So have you started to work with those communities on expanding major rev or like other sort of non-breaking additions to either spec based on your work?
No, so we're suggesting it here for the first time. Happy to get your feedback. Should we?
So I have a little bit of opinion that. I think a couple of things. One of it is with regards to like how do we make relationships within SPDX on like this is a service or this is something that's trying to being run on. And I think that there are a couple of folks within the Yocto project that are working on that. We are also, SPDX has this sub working group called the Build Profile Working Group, and that's something we will be looking into in terms of being able to define something like called a provider or service, right? So to be able to say, I have a certain relationship, this application has a certain relationship with a service, whether it interacts with it or whether it's built on top of it or something like that, right? We're using this in the build context, but we kind of see that it may have potential users outside that as well. And I think like that, but that's still kind of like the encoding of that. I'm not sure whether folks know about the ongoing CISA listening sessions going on this week and next week. But there is a subtopic on cloud. And so I encourage like, Barack and other folks on this call that are like into the cloud SBOM stuff to chime in over there. Basically, they're just like gathering a bunch of ideas and potentially starting up some working groups. So I think that would be a good forum to discuss that.
And what's your opinion? Is where should IBOM live? Or shouldn't?
Yeah, so I think IBOM kind of like has it's a little bit of a superset in the sense of like it does like the SBOM for the infrastructure, but at the same time it also does like partially solves the inventory problem. And so like to me those are two distinct use cases, right? One of them is like the bill of materials for evaluation of whether you want to use a certain product or you want to buy a certain product. And then there is like, how do I respond to an incident, which I think really ties back into inventory a little bit more. I think it's clear to me that for IBOM, it solves the tying this back into like SPDX and having it be part of the SBOM is going to be super useful, at least for procurement purposes and evaluation purposes. I think for the incident response, I think inventory systems will be important here. I'm not sure that I don't think SBOM alone is going to solve the problem of incident response and management there. But SBOM will definitely like play a part. But I think the inventory stuff is going to be more important there.
So I have a couple of thoughts around that, because I do think that I don't necessarily like personally I don't necessarily care so much about the literal inventory today per se. I think it's still important, but I do care, for example, if I have a bunch of Terraform code and the way that it is structured, let's say it's going to spin up vulnerable resources. I care about that. And so if I'm deploying out and this is stuff that could have been detected, for example, after the fact. And I know this is kind of where it gets a little into the weeds of, how do you kind of specify enough elements about the actual what will be deployed in the infrastructure so that when something comes further down the line, you can say, oh, this configuration is what's vulnerable. It's not the software, let's say, it's not the, it's like some configuration of the software or some configuration of the cloud service or the cloud infrastructure that's really causing the vulnerability. And so that's kind of where I'd be interested to see how this evolves. So, because like at the same level, right, it could be very easy to pretty much just sort of plop every element that Terraform would create and then saying, okay, great, now can we scan that and figure out where the vulnerability is? But from my perspective, I think one of the things that I really like about this is, in a lot of ways, it's not, software itself, unless it's running, is not really necessarily just a vulnerable, isn't causing issues. And oftentimes it's, hey, actually, to kind of fit into the VEX model and some of the other things that are coming up, it's, yes, there's a vulnerability in this piece of software, but in addition, the way that it's been configured sort of mitigates this issue. And I think that's super valuable. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
And
Sorry,
do you
go
think the the SBOM is the appropriate place to? I agree and I see the value of that. Do you think the SBOM is the appropriate place to kind of highlight that? That yes, there's a vulnerability, but it could be mitigated by these other mitigating controls.
I think Michael is referring to VEX for that. I think that sounds like yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I know that a lot of folks, there's a lot of different interpretations of SBOM and what it really means. Like personally, I just think based on the way that a lot of it is set up, is it's kind of like a point in time snapshot of, hey, I'm about to deploy a thing, or this is what the software is, this is what that is. And then it would require sort of after the fact, correlation of other data, like the vulnerabilities that are known. Because I think there's certain information that you'll know, hey, right now, there's a vulnerability in this piece of software. But I do think that it's kind of a thorny problem because, otherwise, if what would end up happening is you'd have to sort of regenerate, like the other model is like, hey, I did a scan, this is what I saw in the SBOM, and then these are the vulnerabilities that I saw. Then you would have to sort of regenerate that SBOM every time, as opposed to just sort of going back to the SBOM on an ongoing basis and say, great, is there any vulnerabilities based on this SBOM, as opposed to, are there any, let me generate an SBOM that is a scan of everything that includes those vulnerabilities. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. Thanks.
I think I want to point out. I think I agree with Michael mostly. Unfortunately, there are some compliance requirements that makes you put some of these things into SBOM. So you may see some of that, but mostly for compliance reasons.
Awesome. Any other questions, or we can wrap it up? Brock, anything else you wanted to mention?
What do you think should be the next steps within the CNCF TAG Security, or if there should be any on that specific topic?
I think a couple things. One of it may be to, if you're interested, to maybe just chime in on the SBOM issue. If you have any thoughts over there. I think definitely getting involved with the CSAL working groups, especially on the cloud one. Others just happening outside CNCF, but I think that will be valuable for IBOM to participate in, given that you're basically solving this problem for most of the cloud infrastructure. Other than that, if you're looking in terms of like project progression from incubation and graduation, then I think somewhere down the road, having a security assessment would be kind of the next step for that. Do you have any plans on applying for incubation and graduation?
You mean to submit Chekhov as a CNCF project?
Oh, okay. So now it's not a CNCF project yet.
No, it's an Apache 2 license project, and
okay, yeah. So the first step would be sandbox. Some projects try and apply in as incubation. You can evaluate that, but I think sandbox is going to be much easier, and then to go from sandbox to incubation internally will be a lot easier than just applying in as incubation.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the CNCF TOC, you can ping me. I'll send you a link to the TOC page for the project process.
Quick question, actually, if from the other end, if folks wanted to get involved with Chekhov, join, let's say, community discussions, follow-ups, what's the best?
Yeah, so there's a Slack channel linked from the GitHub repositories. We already have more than 230 open source contributors that are not company employees, and thousands of people opening tickets. So you're more than welcome to join. I'll approve your pull request if it's secure. All right.
I don't think supply chain compromises directly in the repo.
All right, I think that wraps us up for the evening, afternoon, morning.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, have a good one, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.